pleased to welcome this afternoon Professor Scott Appleby, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker. Professor Scott Appleby is the Keough Hesburgh Professor of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. From 2014 to 2024, he served as the inaugural Marilyn Keough Dean of the Keough School. Scott earned his BA from Notre Dame and his master's and PhD from the University of Chicago. And from 1988 to 1993, he was co-director with Martin E. Marty of the Fundamentalism Project, an international public policy study conducted by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He returned to Notre Dame in 1994 as director of the Cushwa Center, succeeding our founding director, Jay Dolan. During his tenure as director, Scott expanded the Cushwa Center's national and interdisciplinary engagement, bringing a stellar lineup of scholars to campus for lectures, seminars, and conferences. Among them, tonight's keynote speaker, José Casanova, 30 years ago in 1995. A high mark of Scott's tenure was the launch of the book series Catholicism in 20th Century America, a collaboration between Cushwa and Cornell University Press that has produced 9 volumes examining Catholic contributions to civic culture and political identity, to labor unions and social ethics, to education, healthcare, and other enterprises led by Catholic women, and to American spirituality and religious practice in the 20th century. Scott launched the project in 1998 and served as series editor until the 9th and final volume was published in 2021. From 2000 to 2014, Scott served as director of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. It was during that time I took a seminar with him on religion, conflict, and peace building as a graduate student, a very memorable class with Atalia Omer, who will be one of our panelists on Saturday for the Dolan Seminar. He launched and today co-directs Contending Modernities, a major multi-year project examining the interaction among Catholic, Muslim, and secular forces in the modern world. Appleby is the author or editor of 15 books, including The Ambivalence of the Sacred, Religion, Violence, and Reconciliation, and he co-edited with Atalia Omer the Oxford Handbook on Religion, Conflict, and Peace Building, and serves as editor of the Oxford University Press's series, Studies in Strategic Peace Building. His other publications include Peace Building, Catholic Theology, Ethics, and Praxis, and Church and Age Unite, the Modernist Impulse in American Catholicism, published by Notre Dame Press. A fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences, Appleby is the recipient of 5 honorary doctorates from Fordham University, Misericordia University, University of Scranton, St. John's, and St. Xavier University in Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Professor Scott Appleby.
Thank you, David. Welcome to everyone. Good to see many familiar faces and many new ones. Imagine, if you will, the following dilemma. I got to set it up for you. In the mid-20th century, the village of Aragon, Spain, produced a disproportionately high number of priest and university students, many of whom had suffered under the Franco regime. As a boy from Aragon, you think you'll become a priest too, and you enroll in a seminary. There you become increasingly drawn to philosophy, and you take note when the Spanish bishops, arriving in Rome for the opening of the Second Vatican Council in 1962, believing themselves to represent the ideal of a Catholic society, are stunned to learn that the Church now supports democracies and that they are regressive figures. Suddenly you realize that, quote, as you put it, everything is thinkable and possible and readable. So you seize on this intellectual openness and move to Austria to study theology, where you read Catholic theologians, Protestant theologians, and theologians of all degrees of radicalism, from liberation theologies to the death of God authors, and you read social criticism, especially of the Frankfurt School. And then you discover, drum roll please, sociology, and the great Jürgen Habermas. So you travel to America to learn German sociology there, of course, and enroll at the New School for Social Research in New York, where you begin work on a dissertation on Spanish modernization under the Franco regime, only to discover that there wasn't much modernization under the Franco regime. Max Weber's thesis comes in handy here, namely that Protestantism, not Catholicism, had created a sociological context that allowed capitalism and modernization to thrive. Yet, still drawn to Catholicism and the Spanish case, you study Opus Dei and learn not that it had helped prevent modernization from occurring, but rather had helped imagine modernization as a form of authoritarian technocratic capitalism. You're confused by your findings. As you put it, at the time, modernization was supposed to be a good thing, and Opus Dei was meant to be the bad guys. How can the bad guys be the carriers of a good thing? Your curiosity drives you to engage the theories of modernization and secularization in the air at the time. The secularization theorists claimed that modernity was necessarily and inevitably accompanied by the differentiation of religious life from other elements of society, not least the state, with the notable exception of the United States. It held that religion would increasingly become privatized and that eventually it would go into decline and even perhaps vanish. So you begin to research cases, Spain, Brazil, Poland, the United States, where you analyze the transformation of American Catholicism from an insecure sect to a defensive private denomination to an assertive public one. From these empirical bases, you propose to challenge, if not debunk entirely, the secularization thesis. In fact, religion was not becoming privatized in the 1970s and 1980s. To the contrary, it was going public in a big way, rivaling or co-opting the state itself in some cases, be it in Iran, Nicaragua, Israel, or Egypt, or India. And religion could hardly be said to be in decline. Differentiated from the state and the economy, yes, but hardly in decline or private on the margins. To the contrary. So here finally is your dilemma. You have prepared this potentially groundbreaking manuscript, which you think could make a difference in the debate raging about religion and secularity. But are you right? Is your argument compelling? Was it any good? How do I know? How to know? No one, after all, had heard of you, including the major sociologists and historians of religion in America. So, facing a tenure decision and needing endorsements, you take the plunge and have the manuscript sent to various luminaries in the field. Deep breath. They liked it very much, this manuscript, which was published in 1994 as Public Religions in the Modern World. Martin Marty credited you, the hitherto complete unknown, José Casanova, with coining the term public religions. David Martin called the book, quote, an exemplary instance of how one kind of sociology of religion ought to be conducted. The book did not set out to find a single narrative about modernity or about religion. Rather, it argued that religion was being reshaped. Modernization did not bring secularity per se, but it did bring the differentiation of social spheres so that no one religion could pervade all elements of social life. In Europe, differentiation simply meant the displacement of the church, which led to the decline in religion. But in America, and in much of the developing world, differentiation came with increased pluralism, and religion began to coexist and compete with one another for believers. The result was the rise of public religions, religions that had become privatized in a context where the state was increasingly separated from belief, but then re-entered the public sphere to actively and vigorously shape political life. Modernization did not bring secularity per se, but it did bring a differentiation of social spheres so that no one religion could pervade all elements of society. Not only did Professor Casanova receive tenure from the New School of Social Research in 1995, so too did this book receive an award from the Association for the Sociology of Religion. By the year 2000, he was the association's president. His work went on to create nothing less than a paradigm shift within the field, reframing the way that religion and secularization are regarded in the modern world. José took seriously the criticisms of the book, that the book was too Western Christian and European in outlook. In his subsequent publications, he reframed much of his focus from the Western world to the developing world and started examining the rise of transnational religious movements. Over the past 2 decades and more, Casanova has expanded and deepened its theoretical framework by extending the scope of analysis to global Pentecostalism, Islam, and other cases beyond the Western and Christian geopolitical sphere, most recently to Ukraine and Eastern Orthodoxy. In so doing, he has further elevated his authority as our guide to the dazzling varieties of secular as well as religious modalities in the modern world. Returning to the case of Catholicism, he has noted the following diminution of the transnational dimensions of Catholicism, that is, the papacy, transnational religious orders and universities, pilgrimages, and so on, the diminution of those transnational elements during the 4 centuries from the Peace of Westphalia to the late 19th, early 20th century, at which point there was a reemergence and reconstruction of these transnational dimensions on a fully global basis, leading to the reconstitution of Catholicism as a non-transnational, as a new transnational and deterritorialized global religious regime, to use José's words. In this context, Casanova refers to, quote, the opportunities that the process of globalization offers to a transnational religious regime with a highly centralized structure and an imposing transnational network of human, institutional, and material resources, which feels, therefore, confident in its ability to thrive in a relatively open system of religious regimes. In 2008, José joined Georgetown University's Berkeley Center as a senior fellow, and not coincidentally, soon thereafter, began to publish studies of the Jesuits and globalization from the 17th century to the present. It's quite appropriate that José is our keynote for this conference that celebrates 50 years of the Cushwa Center and also looks ahead to the renewed emphasis on Catholicism across the Americas. He spoke on the theme of globalization, as David mentioned, in 1995, but I think he has a few different things to say about it today. And so I want you to join me in welcoming our good friend and colleague, José Casanova, who will speak on 3 phases and the globalization of Catholicism in the Americas.
Thank you, Scott, for this very, very nice presentation. Obviously, I was looking at my own development, personal and intellectual, as you were speaking. We've been friends for a long time, since the Fundamentalism Project. You brought me many times to Notre Dame, so I'm really, really happy and honored to be back here to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Cushwa Center. I had a big also association with the Kellogg Institute. I used to visit frequently, also with the Nanovic Center, then with the Kroc. So it has been, in many ways, a place I've visited very frequently. Scott always wanted me to come to Notre Dame. I was considering it, after all, to become a scholar monk in old age is not bad in South Bend. But my wife could never trade either New York City or Washington, D.C. for South Bend, so I'm sorry, but I'm glad to be here. Yes, when the paper I presented here in '95 had not really studied yet the global Catholic missions, especially the role of the Jesuits. And so I was wrong on this thesis. And so I want to, since then I began studying the Jesuits. I rethought everything I knew about modernity, partly precisely because to get away from my old Eurocentrism, which is so built into sociology. So let me present my revisionist view of myself. And I hope that you, Scott, do not take it as being treasonous. After all, we also work together on the Contending Modernities project. And obviously, I'm very fond of Charles Taylor and his Catholic modernity. But I'm going to propose to change the topic. So when I received the invitation, it is a magnificent conference. It's good to see so many young faces as scholars. This is always, for us old people, it's always good to see and hear from young people that are really, really doing fantastic work. So I decided to somewhat change the topic under the heading of the globalization of Catholicism in the Americas, other than under Catholic modernity. My main rationale for this revisionist approach is my conviction that globalization is more adequate and fruitful framework of analysis than modernity for three reasons. First, as a teleological category indicating the direction of historical change, globalization is less ideological than modernity because it does not imply a binary axiological distinction between dividing history between before and after modernity. Modernity ought not to be viewed as the telos or the end of history. Second, in addition, substantively as a category, globalization is less Eurocentric and Western-centric than modernity, and therefore less intrinsically tied to dynamics of Western hegemony. Third, finally, teleologically as well as theologically, one could say that globalization is more Catholic, a category than modernity, insofar as it has a greater affinity with the self-interpretation of the role and function of the Catholic Church in the seculum, that is, in the secular world, in the secular age, that of contributing to the globalization of humanity and the globalization of fraternity as the telos of history before the parousia or the second coming. The problem is not only Eurocentrism. Equally problematic is the kind of modern centrism that permeates the social sciences. My own discipline, sociology, was born as a theory of Western modernity, based on the dichotomous division of tradition and modernity, with the built-in assumption that everything traditional is bound to disappear as outmoded, to be supplanted by progressive modernity. The logical consequence is that history proper, that is, everything that is relevant for the present, begins with the modern age and with the formation of the modern world. That's how Western modernity attains its universal significance and value, to put in the words of Max Weber. In the last 15 years, I've been doing research on the role of the Jesuits as pioneer globalizers in the early modern phase of globalization, examining their encounters with all the religions and cultures of the world in the Americas, in Africa, and in Asia, in an attempt to revise the dominant Western-centric theories of globalization. They are Western-centric insofar as they interpret globalization as a process of expansion of Western modernization to the rest of the world. But an examination of the early modern global colonial encounters, roughly from the age of discoveries that inaugurated the first transatlantic and trans-Pacific exchanges in the early 16th century, to the age of enlightenment and the American and French revolutions in the 18th century, shows that the first globalization took place before Western hegemony and before Western modernity. Similarly, one can argue that contemporary process of globalization in our global age, in our contemporary global age, are no longer characterized by the systemic relations between a Western hegemonic center and non-Western peripheries, but are rather multilateral, that is, many-sided and multifaceted exchanges between multiple centers and multiple peripheries in all quadrants of the globe, north and south, east and west. Pope Francis is correct in characterizing the shape of our contemporary global world after Western hegemony as a spherical polyhedron composed of innumerable social nodal networks. Let me offer a final preliminary remark about my use of the concept of globalization before entering finally into the discussion of the three phases of the globalization of Catholicism in the Americas. In my own work as in today's lecture, by globalization, I simply mean, in very general terms, the increasing connectivity of all peoples and cultures of the world and the accompanying growth in the planetary consciousness of global humanity. Any discussion of globalization needs to pay equal attention to its objective structural dimensions, global connectivity, and to its subjective reflexive ones, global consciousness. Beyond that, in order to make the concept as non-ideological as possible, following Göran Thorborn, a Marxist sociologist, Swedish, I assume that rejects the notion that globalization is capitalism, assume that the, quote, the concept should be abstract, non-containing any a priori statement of concrete content, precisely to leave open its plural, multidimensional, and diverse forms in different historical times and places, that is, in what I call the three phases of globalization. So let me now get into my topic. No way I'm going to cover satisfactorily 500 years of the transformation of Catholicism in the Americas, from Quebec to Brazil. So please, you have to be somehow understanding with me. All of you know a lot about particular aspects, and you can ask questions in the discussion later. I'm going to focus more on the first phase, which I think is the one that really raises my topic or my framework, and less on the second and the third phase, which I will simply schematically point out the transformations of Catholicism across Americas, also in the second and the third phase. So, following the dating we've used in our studies on the Jesuits and globalization, as well as on a new recent book on Asian Pacific Catholicism and globalization, I argue one can distinguish, also in the Americas, three phases of globalization. The first, globalization before Western hegemony. In America, it sounds strange because this is, of course, the age of colonial hegemony. But for the rest of the globe, Western powers were not in a position to colonize any kingdom or any power of Asia. Only the Americas were colonized by Western powers in the first phase of globalization, not the rest of the world. So again, from the 1500s to the American and French revolutions. Second, modern Western hegemonic globalization from the 1770s to the 1960s. And here, while in the first phase you can see very clearly four different types of colonial Catholicism, French colonial Catholicism in Quebec, the beginning of Catholicism in America under Lord Baltimore, also the patron of the Catholics in Maryland, Spanish colonialism in Latin America, and Portuguese colonialism in Brazil. And then the second phase is characterized by national Catholicism throughout the Americas. Obviously, Quebec is a continuation of the first phase, the US also, but the Spanish Empire, out of one empire, you have now 20 different new national Catholic churches, each without contact with one another for basically 100 years, and without contact with Rome for almost the 19th century. So it is this phase of national Catholicism which is part of the process of nationalization, if you wish, or the global expansion of the nation form. Of course, the process of Romanization of Latin American Catholicism really begins after Vatican I and will continue throughout the 20th century until finally, with the 60s, Vatican II really is the coming of age of the global Catholic Church, but also the understanding, all the fathers at Vatican II, that we are entering a new global age and the sign of the times. They read the sign of the times as this new global age well before we social scientists began using the concept of globalization. It's very clear in the last three documents, Gaudium et Spes, Dignitatis Humanae, Nostra Aetate, this is the sign of the time, the new age. So, the fact that one can impose easily the three phases of the globalization of Catholicism in the Americas, in the Asia-Pacific region, and the global transformation of the Society of Jesus within the global Roman Catholic Church indicate that the process of globalization are intrinsically interconnected with the transformations of global Catholicism. The first phase, colonial Catholicism in the Americas under royal patronage. The formation of a single world capitalist system, the formation of a global system of nation states, and the formation of a global system of religions may be said to constitute the three main dynamics of modern process of globalization. All three are intrinsically connected with the global expansion of European colonialism that was initiated by the Iberian colonial expansion into the East and West Indies in the 16th century, opening the way for what has been called the first globalization. If one takes the qualifier global literally, one can talk of globalization only properly once the discovery of the New World and the circumnavigation around the globe created for the first time the conditions of possibility for real global connectivity and for real global consciousness. As we know, on the basis of theological constructs of papal jurisdiction over non-Christian lands and peoples, in 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas drew an imaginary meridian line of demarcation whereby all the lands newly discovered or to be discovered west of the line will belong to the Kingdom of Castile, while all the lands east of the line will belong to the Kingdom of Portugal. On this basis, both the colonization and the spiritual conquest of the Americas started. The spiritual conquest of the Americas, namely the Catholic evangelization from Brazil to New France, took place under the administrative jurisdiction of royal patronage. The Portuguese Padroado Regio, the Spanish Patronato Real, the French royal patronage in Maryland is very brief, but also under the patronage of Lord Baltimore. It was the system whereby the Catholic monarchs gained papal legitimacy for their imperial expansion and, most importantly, administrative control of the ecclesiastical institutions in the colonies, including the power of patronage over the appointment of bishops and other ecclesiastical appointments in exchange of their obligation to Christianize the colonized populations. The placet, namely the royal placet, meant that the Pope has no right to direct any direct communication with the churches in the colonies. They have to be mediated by the Catholic monarchs. So there is no direct contact between any of these colonies and Rome throughout the colonial period. While the imperial princes of Portugal, Spain, and France, aiming to all three becoming competing universal Christian monarchies, is the foundation of the military conquest and colonization of the Americas, the Catholic evangelization has an additional, non-reducible source in the early modern Catholic revival that flourished in Italy and in the Iberian Peninsula well before the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. That's why the new historiography has challenged the older characterization of the Catholic renewal as counter-reformation, most importantly because of the narrow Eurocentrism that the old term counter-reformation implies. This was, after all, the era when Catholicism attained its global reach from East Asia to North America and from South America to the Philippines and the Pacific. This was the era when Catholicism became a world religion. In the words of Ronald Pochiak, quote, "The centuries of Catholic renewal form the first period of global history shaped by, quote, the encounter between Catholic Europe and the non-Christian world." It was the golden age of global Catholic missions that flourished in the 16th and 17th centuries, well before the emergence of Protestant global missions, first towards the end of the 18th century. Although the Catholic missionary enterprise in the Americas was irremediably embedded in colonial coercion and imperial power structures, the religious orders, Franciscans, Dominicans, Mercedarians, etc., and the new orders, especially the Jesuits, were able to maintain a certain autonomy vis-à-vis royal patronage, something which the ecclesiastical diocesan authorities were not able to do. at times functioning as protectors of the indigenous population from the European colonizers, and occasionally raising courageously their prophetic voices against the colonial authorities and appealing to the higher authority of the monarch or the Pope. Very soon after the initiation of the colonization and evangelization of the Hispaniola island in the Caribbean, on the fourth Sunday of Advent in 1511, the Dominican Antonio de Montesines preached his prophetic sermon warning the Spanish colonies that, quote, they are all in mortal sin and live and die in it because of the cruelty and tyranny they practice among those innocent people. The continuous critical transatlantic communication between Dominican missionaries in the New World and Dominican theologians at the School of Salamanca, such as Domingo de Soto and Francisco de Vitoria, established the foundations for the modern Jus Gentium, precursor of modern international law, as well as the modern doctrine of human rights, and their advocacy served as the origin of modern global humanitarianism. In the audience in Santo Domingo, listening to Montesinos' sermon, was Bartolomé de las Casas, an encomendero at the time who was moved to become a Dominican priest, served as the most influential and critical voice in the inter-Dominican exchange between missionaries in America and theologians in Salamanca and Valladolid, and was acclaimed as protector of the Indias. It was, of course, Gustavo Gutierrez became a Dominican priest himself by precisely following also the route of Bartolomé de las Casas. I'm going to concentrate on the Jesuits because they are the most interesting. They are not only the pioneer globalizers, but also really, if we are going to talk of Catholic modernity, they do represent it more than anybody else. Now, the Jesuits arrived very late in Spanish America, first in 1568 in Peru, and in 1572 in Mexico, when the spiritual conquest of the former Aztec Empire had already been accomplished primarily by Franciscans and Dominicans. In the Spanish Empire, the Jesuits found their particular niches, firstly in the foundation of urban colleges and universities, for the formation of their own seminarians, for the formation of Spanish colonial elites, and for the formation of the sons of Indian caciques. And secondly, in the formation of Indian parishes, or doctrinas, and of Indian redactions at the peripheries of the empire, from the famous Guarani redactions in Paraguay, the missions among the warring Mapuche tribes in Chile, and missions among Amazonian tribes throughout South America, to their missions in Baja California and in the Sonoran Desert in northwestern Mexico and Arizona. It was their dual vocation as professional global missionaries. It's the first order which is a professional global missionary order. Other orders had missionaries. The Jesuits are born as missionaries. All of them have a vow to become global missionaries. But also, when they were established, they had no idea they would become professional schoolmasters. But after the formation of the first Jesuit college in Messina in 1948, they of course became the great schoolmasters, global schoolmasters, throughout the 16th and 17th century and 18th century throughout the globe. The missionaries, and it is this dual vocation as professional missionaries and professional school teachers, or global educators, that facilitated what has been called the Jesuit geography of knowledge. The missionaries wrote detailed reports of the conditions in their global missions, natural, geographic, demographic, ethnographic, linguistic, historical, and cultural, which they sent regularly to their superiors, who in turn sent them to the most important Jesuit colleges in Europe. And there, this novel information was first processed into new scientific knowledge and then distributed in print form to all kinds of publics, eventually reaching also Jesuit colleges and Jesuit missions around the world. The virtuous feedback between the global network of Jesuit colleges and the global network of Jesuit missions made the Jesuits into pioneer globalizers. The career of José Acosta may serve as an illustration, but I'm going to skip it. You go to Wikipedia and you will find it. It's a fascinating story. Obviously, came to Peru. He was the great theologian of the Council of Lima, which was the Latin American version of the Council of Trent. Wrote the Catechism along with his Jesuit colleges, was professor of theology in Lima as well in Cusco. Then he himself established 7 or 8 colleges everywhere. And of course, through his travels throughout Latin America, from the Peru through Central America and Mexico, then he wrote the Historia Natural and Moral de las Indias. The first attempt really to study, to do a scientific study, we would say, of the New World, both natural, geography, and cultural ethnography, if you wish, but already within a global history of humanity, to which he incorporates already the knowledge he's receiving from Ricci and other Jesuit missionaries in India, Japan, China, etc. So here you have somebody who is writing this history of the Americas in the context already of a global history of the development of the human species, of global humanity. His 2 most important works, De Procuranda Indorum Salute, and How to Bring About the Salvation of the Indians, is a typical missiological treatise, which basically argues to Christianize the indigenous people, you don't need to Hispanize them. On the contrary, the more we protect them from Spanish colonialism, the better. So we have to bring the gospel, become enculturated in the new languages, and so the idea is evangelization doesn't require Hispanization at all, which of course is the same story that Ricci and Balignano in Japan are saying. We have to become ourselves first enculturated into Japanese culture, to Chinese culture, into all the indigenous cultures. Spanish was never spoken in the Guarani redactions. Everybody spoke Guarani, a language which the Jesuits themselves formatted from different Guarani dialects. And of course, today, Paraguay is the only country that has Guarani as an official language because it's the only country that continues speaking Guarani, not Spanish, for a very long time. And was the first national republic to be truly unified because it had no cleavages between the Criollo elites and the indigenous population. The other work I already mentioned. So while the Jesuits were relative latecomers, so I have until 5:30, okay. Relative latecomers into the Spanish American Empire, they were the first Catholic missionaries in Brazil, in New France, and the British colonies of North America. The colonization of Brazil only began in earnest in 1549 with the arrival of the first Portuguese governor, Tomé de Sousa, who was accompanied by a group of Jesuit priests. Governor Tomé founded the capital city of Salvador in Bahia, while the Jesuit priests began to gather the aborigines into settlement communities called aldeas and to establish schools for them. Around some of these first settlements will grow later many of the most important Brazilian cities, such as Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo began as a small school for Indians. You can still go to the original school in the center of Sao Paulo. And Rio de Janeiro. They began as Jesuit settlements. In this respect, the Jesuit missions may be said to constitute the foundations of modern Brazil in the same way as Jesuits Manuel de Nobrega, Leonardo Nunes, Martín de Azpilicueta, José de Anchieta, or Antonio Vieira may be considered founding fathers of Brazil. Like the Apostle St. Paul, the Jesuits view themselves as global apostles to the Gentiles, and there were a lot of new Gentiles they had discovered. And very frequently, the first foundational colleges they established in many of their missions were named after the Apostle St. Paul. St. Paul in Goa, the first Jesuit college in Asia. St. Paul in Macau, again, the first Jesuit college to serve the China and Japanese missions. São Paulo in Brazil, São Paulo in Lima, São Paulo in Mexico City, and so on. You could go on. So they view it as São Paulo in the Areópago, teaching about this unknown God. This is what this Jesuit college were supposed to do. The same can be said about the Jesuit foundational role in the French colony of New France. In the classical history of the United States of America, George Bancroft wrote, quote, "The history of their labors is connected with the origin of every celebrated town in the annals of French America. Not a cape was turned, nor a river entered, but a Jesuit led the way." From the arrival of Pierre Viard and Enemond Massé in Port-Royal in 1601, to the transference of the province of Quebec to the British Empire in 1760, some 330 French Jesuits arrived in New France. Some of their names, such as Jean de Brebeuf or Jacques Marquette, are associated with famous explorations from the Atlantic through the Great Lakes up to Lake Winnipeg and down the Mississippi River Valley. Sponsored by French royal patronage, their task was dual: to bring the gospel to the Indian nations of North America and to serve as apostles of empire, advancing Bourbon's France mission civilisatrice. Even in the British colonies of North America, the Jesuit mission was sponsored by feudal patronage. Cecil Calvert, the second Lord Baltimore, who inherited the colony of Maryland, decided to manage it as a colony of English Catholics. To take possession of the Maryland colony, the Ark and the Dove sailed to America in 1634. So the last one. It was 1549 Brazil, 1568 and 72 Mexico and Peru, 1601 New France, 1634 Maryland. I'm going to quote from somebody we are celebrating his heritage, his J.P. Dolan, from his great classic book, The American Catholic Experience. And he writes, the list of passengers on board included 3 Jesuits, which of course were secret Jesuits, nobody knew they were Jesuits, 16 gentlemen adventurers, the majority of whom were Catholic, and a host of servants, laborers, and artisans, the majority of whom were Protestant. The Ark and the Dove could serve as befitting a symbol of Catholic Maryland as the Mayflower, which had arrived 14 years earlier, was of Puritan New England. While the covenanted pilgrims were to be a city upon a hill, Lord Proprietor Baltimore instructed his governor and commissioners that, quote, all acts of Roman Catholic religion be done as privately as may be, and that Catholics be silent upon all occasions of discourse concerning matters of religion, end of quote. Actually, Catholic hegemony over colonial Maryland was short-lived. By 1689, the Protestant Revolution along the Chesapeake Bay, part of the glorious English Revolution, had established Protestant supremacy in colonial Maryland. I try to point out the parallel structures of similar types of colonial Catholicism sponsored by different kinds of European royal aristocratic patronage and the crucial role played by the Jesuits in this first phase of globalization of Catholicism in the Americas from Quebec to Brazil. I've claimed that the Jesuits were pioneer globalizers in the first globalization, arguably the first organized group to think and to act globally. Indeed, the first one to view the entire globe as their home and as the theater of their activities. Undoubtedly, the primary mission and ultimate of the Jesuit global enterprise was the universal salvation of souls ad majorem Dei gloriam. But one still needs to explain why the Jesuits spent so much time and effort in what we will call today secular activities, from cartography to military fortifications, from astronomy to botany and other forms of scientific research, for building plaques to building canons, from advising rulers to educating indigenous children, from theater production to music and ballet. Without ever losing sight of their primary salvational mission, Jesuit ministries encompass all kinds of activities and spheres that today may be considered secular, but that they regarded as an intrinsic part of their religious mission, of their vocation to find God in all things. In this respect, the Jesuits are paradigmatic representatives of what may be termed early Catholic modernity. But this dual character is simultaneously religious and secular, was for many observers a sign of confusion and contradiction. Critics in France call the Jesuits literally a hermaphrodite order for being half religious and half laic. They were too secular and worldly for the religious people, while simultaneously their secular contributions could never be accepted as fully modern by secular modern, because their activities, as meritorious as they may have been, were still embedded in religious purpose and rationales. From this perspective, Catholic modernity can never pass the muster set by Protestant or secular modernity. Therein lies the ideological standard of the category of modernity. Yet, irrespective of the evaluation one might make of Jesuit Catholic modernity, less questionable is the fact that from their foundation in 1540 to their suppression by the papacy in 1773, no other group, and you can't think of any other group, and you can correct me, but no other group contributed as much as they did to global connectivity between peoples and cultures of the world, north and south, east and west, and to global consciousness. They did so not only through their ubiquitous missions and colleges, over 300 all over the world by the time they were suppressed, but also through their prodigious production and global distribution of all kinds of knowledge, as well as through their global circulation of all kinds of instruments and objects, from scientific instrument to printing presses and type scripts to translate the gospel into every possible language, from medicinal plants to all kinds of sacred objects, icons and paintings, church architectural styles, music, drama, and ballet. Did you know that Italian opera was born in a Jesuit college? And do you know that French ballet was born in a Jesuit college? What they were doing, these dramas that the Jesuits put there for their students. In the process, they also link in global connectivity, as represented in the painted ceiling of St. Ignatius Church in Rome, and I hope that you all will visit it someday if you have not done so, the Catholicism of the Americas and the Catholicism of Asia, the Catholicism of Europe and the Catholicism of Africa, thereby enhancing the global consciousness of the Catholic Church. But similar paintings depicting transcontinental and global scenes can be found in Jesuit churches and colleges throughout the Americas, from the Inca Sixtine Chapel in the Church of San Pedro Apóstol de Andahuaylas near Cusco, to the missions of the Pimería Alta established by the Italian Jesuit Eusebio Kino in the Sonoran Desert. Indeed, it is not surprising to find at the beginning of the 17th century, before London, Paris, or Amsterdam had developed a consciousness of being global cities, the inhabitants of Mexico City had acquired already a consciousness of their city being a central node of global commerce, crisscrossing the Atlantic and the Pacific, that brought news and products for the four quadrants of the globe. Read the poem, 1604 poem by Bernardo de Balbuena, La Grandeza Mexicana, where precisely there is a description of the whole world and how the whole world comes through Mexico City. All products, ideas, comes through Mexico City. Among the popular products reaching Catholic New Spain in Peru were ivory crosses and statues of the Child Jesus and the Virgin Mary made by Chinese craftsmen in Manila's Binondo, the world's oldest Chinatown outside of China. Among the news first reaching New Spain on its way to Spain and Rome were reports celebrating the fate of Japanese martyrs who died in defense of their Catholic faith at the end of Japan's Christian century, from the 1540s to the 1640s. By the middle of the 18th century, as the first phase of globalization was coming to an end, and other Western powers began to trade directly with China, Spanish Manila, and Portuguese Macau ceased to play the nodal global role between China and Europe they had played for 2 centuries. The independence of the Spanish-American colonies also brought largely to an end trans-Pacific connections between the Philippines and the New World. The whole thing begins to come to an end in the Treaty of Paris in 1750. Treaty of Paris redraw the boundaries between the Spanish and the Portuguese Empire. As a result, the 7 easternmost Guarani reductions had to become part of Brazil. These 7 refused to do so, and the rest of the Guaranis, basically in solidarity, started a war against the Portuguese and the Spanish imperial armies, a war which in the first day defeated both armies. Militias that had been educated by the Jesuits precisely to defend the Guaranis from the Paulistas, slave raiders that were constantly attacking them, and to defend the borders of the Spanish Empire. The suppression of the expulsion of the Jesuits from Portugal and from the entire vast Portuguese Empire, from Macau to Brazil, came, the first one, in 1759. 5 years later came the dissolution of the society in France, 1 year after Quebec had become a province of the British Empire in the also 1673 Treaty of Paris, and the drastic expulsion of all the Jesuits from Spain and the entire Spanish Empire by royal decree came suddenly in the middle of the night on February 27, 1667. 6 years later, Pope Clemens IV, under pressure from all the Catholic monarchs, decided to suppress the Society of Jesus. And this was 3 years before the American Democratic Revolution, which can be said to be the beginning of the second globalization. The first globalization was not yet a Western-centric globalization. It was global history through the connected histories from different parts of the globe. But there was not yet a center, a global center, and global peripheries. All of Asia was not part of this. The New World was, but nothing of Asia other than the Philippines, and practically nothing of Africa. So it was only in the second phase of globalization that now, yes, through the American and French revolutions, which proclaimed the idea that all men are created equal, not only French and not only Americans, but all men are created equal, an idea that will reverberate throughout the world. The Napoleonic Wars will bring both the revolutionary fever of liberté, égalité, fraternité, and the nationalist counter fever of being against Napoleon, from Russia to Spain, from Egypt to basically different parts of the world. The anti-Napoleonic Wars in Spain, of course, is what leads to the Latin American revolutions of independence, and before the French Revolution had led to the liberation of Haiti, the first Latin American post-colonial nation, which of course will be the first one of a long line of post-colonial, non-Western, non-white nations that will be free from colonialism. The paradox is at the very same time that colonialism comes to an end in the Americas, the rest of the world begins to become colonized by Europe. Asia now begins to be colonized in earnest. So if here the dual dynamic of cosmopolitan liberation, post-colonial liberation, represented by all the nations of the Americas. After all, Benedict Anderson developed his theory of the imagined communities looking at the Latin American republics. Same language, same religion, same culture, and 20 different nations. Which kind of thing is this nationalism? It was invented, right? There was not such a thing before during the Spanish Empire. And at the same time, of course, you have, as I said, the colonization. Now, the argument I'm making is that now you have formations of national Catholicisms. In Quebec, interestingly, now under British rule, the French Catholic authorities realized that to gain freedom with the British, they accommodate their rule, and especially against the French Revolution, they enter in alliance against all the liberal ideas, revolutionary ideas, free thought, with the new merchant classes of Quebec are trying to bring. And from now on, this coalition of a very, very anti-revolutionary, very conservative, very ultramontane Catholic Church in Quebec under British rule will be what will make into Quebec, by the end of the 19th century, the most religious society of North America. From 1840, when around 40% of the population went regularly to Mass, to the end of the 19th century, when 97% of the population went regularly to Mass. The number of priests skyrocketed. The numbers of sisters and religious orders multiplied. And you have a model then of Catholic revival in North America. The Americans, the story is very, very different. How a Catholic minority not under Protestant British rule, but under majority Protestant, but under separation of church and state, can write to the priests under John Carroll, write this letter to Rome with great enthusiasm. A revolution has happened in our religious system, more important than the revolution in the political system. We are completely free. And not only we are free, we want to be free to elect our own bishop. Will you allow us? Because we need to do it so that people don't think that the Pope is controlling us. The Pope accepted it, so the priests, who happen to be most of them ex-Jesuit priests, like John Carroll himself, elected John Carroll as the first bishop. And there you have the birth of the American Catholic Church as what has been called the Republican phase of American Catholicism. Later comes, of course, the immigrant phase. If Georgetown is representative of the American Republican phase, John Carroll and so on, if you look at the symbol of Georgetown is a Republican eagle, basically with a globe and the cross. Notre Dame is the symbol of immigrant Catholic America. Again, a new order that came here, made home, was founded in France in 37. By 41, they were here at Notre Dame, the Holy Cross Fathers, and from here, then they expand through Americas, through North America, Sacré-Cœur, Oratory of St. Joseph, all the way to the Americas, and eventually to Chile, Peru, Brazil, etc. And the United States, as your provost has shown magnificently, became the refuge for the Jesuits that, as the papal order, were expelled again and again from every liberal revolution in Europe and Latin America. They found refuge here, and here they found missions again. They founded 50 colleges, not all of them successful, but there's still 28 still remaining colleges. And of course, from here they began their global expansion again to the rest of the world. And then eventually, from the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, building Jesuit colleges all over Latin America as well, and into Tokyo, and later into India, and so on. Spanish America, of course, you have now 20 nations. And as I said, 20 different forms of Catholicism. The Placet meant that the Vatican had no connection with the new nations. Now, after independence, the Vatican is not sure whether to recognize the nations or not, because it doesn't want to antagonize the Spanish monarch, that still claims they are still ours. These new republics, they are rebels. We still want to reconquer them. The Pope takes them for about more than a decade to make a decision. They do not accept that the royal patronage should go to the new sovereign, the nation or the people, and therefore they do not accept national patronage. So the result, for about 2 decades, all the episcopal sees in Latin America are basically empty. The bishops left with the imperial armies, and no new bishops came. It's almost a wonder that Catholicism, that Latin America remained a Catholic country thanks to the popular religiosity of ordinary people, despite practically the absence of priests, no structures. The states controlled the churches throughout, in the midst of political instability, fighting between liberals, anti-clerical, and conservatives. But of course, we might make crucial difference. Chile is a radically different story than Argentina, then Colombia, then Costa Rica, then Mexico. And so we will have to get into 20 different Catholic transformations of their churches. The new Vatican I is a turning point. About 39 bishops from all over Latin America go there, and they find out that they are members of this global Catholic Church. The group of American bishops was larger, it was 50. Almost practically every US bishop went, only half of the Latin American bishops went. When the Brazilian bishops came back to Brazil, the emperor of Brazil, who was the old Portuguese monarch that went to exile in Brazil, was not only the head of the church de facto, but he was also the head of the Brazilian Freemasonry. And when they told him, look, we heard from the new doctrine of Rome that you are supposed to be loyal to Rome more than to you. Yeah? Go to jail. He put them in prison for a week and had no problem with them. Until, of course, finally the separation of church and state came with the republic. And, as we know, the Romanization of Brazilian Catholicism is a process that lasts throughout the 20th century. Read my 2 chapters on American Catholicism and Brazilian Catholicism that tries to do an overall view of Latin American. Obviously, there are many changes. The social teachings of the church, social Catholic movements, Catholic action, Christian democratic parties. Again, in Chile, you have a Christian democratic party in Chile before you have it anywhere in Europe. So at the time of political Catholicism, where all the Catholicism was looking for a third way between liberal, bourgeois, Jewish, Protestant democracy, and Bolshevik socialism, the third road, the Catholic road, all forms of Catholic fascism, corporatism. In Chile, a group broke with the Falange and established the First Christian Democratic Party and joined in a popular front with other democratic parties against right-wing governments. And then, of course, we come to the new phase, which is, I would say, Vatican II. For the global Catholic Church, Vatican II is a radical turning point. Bishops who had never seen each other suddenly came to face one another. Over 500 bishops from Latin America, several hundred bishops from the US, and thousands of bishops at the end from the rest of the world. From Asia, they've never seen each other. Out of it came Medellin, the Asian conference, episcopal conferences of bishops, and so on and so on. And, as we heard, liberation theology, the first, you could say, really reproduction out of Latin American Catholicism that will go global and will transform the Catholic Church throughout Asia. Different types of liberation, Catholic liberation theology, which again are not copies of Latin America. What makes them equal is they use the same method, not the content. Liberation theology is black liberation theology, very different from feminist liberation theology, from Jewish liberation theology, from Muslim liberation, but the method that was developed by Gustavo Gutierrez is basically the same. And this is what makes it into the thing. And of course, then, at the end, you have John Paul II coming to Mexico City, bringing all the bishops from America and telling them, from now on, you should view them yourselves as one single Pan-American Catholic Church. The Virgin of Guadalupe is your patron saint. And so let's begin to think globally. We are in the process. It's only the beginning. We don't know where we are going. We know that we are now facing very, very, very strong rejections, nationalist backlash, America first, as opposed to global fraternity. And I think the Catholic Church has shown in the last 20 years, through global crisis, one of the most important voices, especially with this Pope, but already before. I mean, the last 5 popes, all of them were for the globalization of fraternity in different ways. And that this is one of the functions, roles of the Catholic Church in the world. It's up to us, Catholic universities, whether we will listen to this Catholic vocation or, like the Ivy League schools, will simply cave in to the powers that be and resist and say, no, social teachings of the church is not liberalism. So don't tell us that we are liberals because we are for helping refugees and immigrants. This is the social teaching of our church. So we are in a fork in the road, and I think that the global Catholic Church has a lot of resources and a lot of impulses to play important global roles in the future. But we don't know, of course. History is contingent. But I wanted to show that the transformations throughout the Americas, parallel transformations, the first phase, very parallel forms of colonial Catholicism, the second phase, similar but different, because obviously Quebecois Catholicism is very different from US Catholicism. Today, of course, Quebec, that was the most religious society of North America, today is more radically secular. After the Silent Revolution, there is very little left of Quebecois Catholicism. What remains is Francophone Catholicism, and the Catholicism brought by so many new immigrants, the same way that all new immigrants from all over the Americas and from all over the world are revitalizing the U.S. Catholic Church again. Okay, I'll finish with that. I think. Yeah.